Welcome to a brief and very biased history of the internet. Subtitled, Nerdy White Guys Who Changed the World, Connecting the World Byte by Byte, or From the ENIAC to the Star Wars Kid. So what I think this slide well represents is that there's been a constant historical push against new media and a concern that every time a new device or tool for disseminating literacy emerges, that some past practice or past technology is going to be destroyed. We'll come back to this in a moment. The overriding argument of this slideshow is that it's important for us as teachers to have a sense of the development of and the history of the web. I think to understand what's going on in terms of the web today and how the web is being used. So let's go back a bit. Let's go back to the internet around 1968. There was no internet in 1968. There are two competing histories in regard to how the internet came about. The first is what I like to call the X-Files version, that there was this sense that if the Russians, our enemies in the midst of the Cold War and these massive superpower battles, were to bomb us, the first city to fall would be Washington, D.C., where most of our country's history, documents, files, folders, and more lived in, of course, in the 50s and 60s, non-digital format. We could potentially lose our entire cultural history. The second dynasty of the internet, story two, is that people were thinking in the 1950s and 60s and seeing great potential in the ways in which we could better share information. Imagine, we're researchers, it's the early 1960s, I'm working with you, you work at Stanford, I have to send you piles of data for a project we're working on. There's only one option for transmitting that data, and it's a slow option. So much of the military and educational research that was going on at the time was hindered by how slow information could be shared. So let's go back to when computers started to emerge on our cultural landscape. And I love this description, or this set of descriptions. The earlier computers each filled a large room and were more high-priced toys than functional machines. And even when computers became more manageable and functional, they were mostly the domain of business, not the general populace, and certainly not the classroom. So that one quote takes us from the 1940s really into the 1980s. And then Dennis Barron notes the mainframe computer, when it was first introduced, was intended to perform numerical calculations too tedious or complex to do by hand, and these were often missile trajectories, frankly. The ENIAC, the electronic numerical integrator and computer, dates around 1943. It was built at the University of Pennsylvania. The EDVAC came along a couple years later, the electronic discrete variable automatic computer, also at the University of Pennsylvania, who really led the move in the early days to the development of computers. University of Illinois, 1949, 2 years later, the ORDVAC emerges on the technological scene. In 1961, the Ballistic Research Laboratory, a United States Department of Defense affiliated lab, develops the BRLESC-1. And I love this picture from the government's databases of women holding some of the circuit chips from these early computers. This visually gives us a sense of how massive these changes were and, frankly, how quickly they occurred. In 1945, a researcher called Vannevar Bush wrote a progressive essay called As We May Think. And one of the things he was negotiating in his essay was where we were culturally and historically. And he talks about leaving World War II and these massive numbers of scientists and researchers, both educational and military linked, turning their collective eyes and heads and hearts toward their next steps, a move away from warfare time and military technologies to something else. And that something else, many historians would argue, was the development of computers and digital networks. In 1945, the same year Vannevar Bush published his essay, "The First Computer Bug Was Reported." A moth flew into a machine and fried it, documented here in this record from 45. In 1946, the ENIAC is in use, again developed at University of Pennsylvania. It was our first large-scale general-purpose electronic computer. So let's talk a bit about the chilly cultural and historical climate in which the internet emerged. What you're hearing is the telemetry of the Soviet Union's Sputnik, the first artificial satellite as it orbits the globe. The United States, a few weeks after this 1957 event, attempted to launch its own artificial satellite, which shot a few feet up into the air, crashed into the ground, and reports have it burst into flames. It was dubbed in the press Kaputnik. In 1958, in response to the Soviet Union's developing technology in space, military, and networks, President Eisenhower signed into being ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, and NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. In 1961, Russia put a man in orbit and brought him back alive to, as the headline reads, win the space race. In 1962, the ARPA project continues to grow and is now a partnership among a collection of educational and military and corporate institutions. And Bruce Sterling does a great job in a piece on the history of the internet, describing how the internet was originally envisioned. And he says, the network would be assumed to be unreliable at all times. So if a node was broken or inaccessible or down, the packets of information being sent could bounce on to another node and continue its journey across network space.